cold Chicago wind whips down North Clark Street. The air smells of soot and snow. It's 10:30 in the morning, February 14th, 1929. The sky is the color of wet ash. Inside a modest brick garage at 2122 North Clark, 7 men stand shivering. Their breath plumes in the frigid air. The place smells of motor oil and stale whiskey, a ghost of the illegal hooch they once peddled. They're wearing their best suits, overcoats, ties. They think they're waiting for a friend. They think they're safe. Suddenly, the rickety wooden door creaks open. Not one man, but 3. 2 are in police uniforms, their brass buttons gleaming dully in the weak light. The third is in a long, dark overcoat. A wave of relief passes through the 7 men. Cops. It's just the cops. Maybe it's a raid. A bribe. A routine shakedown. This is Chicago, after all. These are the rules of the game. But then the men in uniforms raise their weapons. Not billy clubs. Not service revolvers. They level Thompson submachine guns. The relief in the room curdles, instantly, into a cold, gut-wrenching terror. There is no command. No demand. Only the metallic, oiled click of a bolt being drawn back. One of the 7, Frank Gassenberg, has just enough time to utter a single, disbelieving word. No. The world explodes. The staccato roar of the Tommy guns is unimaginably loud in the confined space. It is not a burst of gunfire, but a storm. A hailstorm of 45 caliber bullets chewing into brick, into car metal, into flesh. The sound echoes off the concrete floor, a deafening, relentless thunder that lasts for 10 full seconds. Empty shell casings clatter and spin, gleaming brass coins on the oil-stained ground. When the guns fall silent, the ringing in the air is almost worse. A high-pitched whine that seems to swallow all other sound. Then, the smell. The acrid, unforgettable tang of cordite, overpowering the scent of oil. And beneath it, the coppery, sickly sweet scent of fresh blood. 6 of the 7 men are down. Torn apart. Lifeless. The garage is a charnel house. Somehow, Frank Gassenberg is still breathing. He is riddled with 14 bullets. When real police arrive on the scene, drawn by the noise, they find him clinging to a thread of life. A detective kneels beside him, the blood soaking into the knees of his trousers. "Frank, who did it?" he urges, his voice tight. "Who shot you?" Frank Gassenberg, a gangster to his last, agonizing breath, looks up through a haze of pain. His lips part. He whispers the final, unbreakable code of the streets. "Nobody shot me." To understand the carnage in that garage, you have to step back to a city drunk on a terrible, beautiful dream. Chicago, 1920. The Great War is over. The roaring 20s have begun. Jazz spills from speakeasy doors. Skyscrapers claw at the sky. There is a new energy, a frantic, modern pulse. And then, the law, the Volstead Act. Prohibition. With a single, misguided piece of legislation, the American government outlawed the manufacture and sale of alcohol. It created a vacuum. A multi-billion-dollar vacuum. And nature, and the underworld, abhors a vacuum. Into this void stepped men who were not kings, but who acted like them. They built empires not on steel or railroads, but on beer. On the simple, human desire for a drink. They were the bootleggers, the rum runners, the gangsters. The 2 most powerful kings in Chicago were not friends. They were polar opposites, ruling adjacent territories in a fragile, bloody peace. On the north side, George Bugs Moran, a throwback, a brawler from the old neighborhood with a volatile temper and a face like a fist. He was loud, brutish, and ruled through fear and loyalty. His men were street toughs, Irish and German immigrants. They controlled the liquor supply for a vast, thirsty part of the city. Moran was old school. He believed in the power of a lead pipe and a grimace. On the south side, Alphonse Scarface Capone, a new breed of criminal. He was a businessman, a syndicate boss. He saw bootlegging not as a crime, but as a service industry. He was slick, corpulent, and dressed in immaculate, expensive suits. He cultivated the press, gave to charity, and saw violence not as a first resort, but as a cost of doing business. A necessary, final cost. His organization was a corporation, with departments for distribution, bribes, and enforcement. His territory was a sprawling, corrupt kingdom he called the Outfit. The border between their territories was a war zone, a no man's land of hijacked liquor trucks, bombed-out saloons, and dead men in alleyways. The tension was a constant, low hum beneath the city's jazz soundtrack. A single spark, and the whole thing would ignite. That spark came in the form of a fist. Or, more precisely, a betrayal. Capone, the businessman, wanted a monopoly. He saw Moran's chaotic North Side operation as an inefficiency, an unprofessional outfit that needed to be acquired. He made an offer. Moran, the brawler, laughed in his face. The war was on. It started with pinpricks. A Capone-owned brewery was firebombed. A Moran beer truck was ambushed, its drivers left on the roadside, their pockets turned inside out. Then, it escalated. The city held its breath. In 1926, Capone's men laid a trap for Moran. They knew he frequented a certain Sicilian restaurant. They filled a parked car with enough dynamite to vaporize a building. They waited. Moran was late. His lieutenant, Diamond Joe Esposito, was not. He drove past the car. The world turned white, then orange. The concussion shattered windows for a block. Esposito and his car were scattered across the street in 1,000 pieces. A message, written in fire and shrapnel. Moran had gotten lucky. The hits continued. A Capone gunman was found in a ditch, his body a pincushion for ice picks. A Moran enforcer was machine-gunned in a phone booth, the glass shattering around him like a deadly rain. But the key to the whole bloody affair, the man who would unwittingly set the stage for the massacre, was a different kind of player. His name was Pets, or so they said. A shadowy figure, a freelance assassin so loyal to Capone he was considered part of the family. He was a ghost. A rumor. The police had no real description, no fingerprints, no photograph. He was Capone's ultimate weapon, a spectre used to terrify his enemies. By 1929, the fragile peace had shattered completely. The war was costing Capone money. It was bad for business. Moran, emboldened by his survival, was becoming a symbol of resistance. He mocked Capone in the papers, called him the behemoth, a fat, overblown tyrant. The insults stung the image-conscious Capone. The businessman was losing his patience. The predator was beginning to emerge. Capone decided it was time for a final solution. Not a skirmish. Not a warning. A decapitation. He would remove Moran and his entire senior leadership in one spectacular, terrifying stroke. He would teach the city and the world what happened when you crossed Al Capone. He summoned his most trusted lieutenants to a suite in the Lexington Hotel, his fortress headquarters. The air was thick with cigar smoke and conspiracy. The plan was audacious, brutal, and simple. They would use Moran's own greed against him. They would dangle the ultimate bait, a truckload of high-quality, hijacked Canadian whiskey, available at a bargain price. It was an offer Moran's men couldn't refuse. They were to meet the hijackers at the SMC Cartage Company garage on North Clark Street. A perfect, isolated location. The trap was set. The players were moving into position. All that was needed now was for the king of the North Side to take the bait. The morning of February 14th dawned bitter and grey. A sharp wind sliced between the brick buildings of Chicago's North Side, carrying the promise of more snow. At the Lexington Hotel, Al Capone was not in the city. He was hundreds of miles away, at his palatial estate in Palm Island, Florida. He had the perfect alibi. The sun was warm there. The air smelled of salt and hibiscus. He lounged by the pool, a picture of tranquility, while the machinery of his vengeance clicked into place downtown. On North Clark Street, the men began to arrive. They were Moran's top lieutenants, the brain and brawn of his operation. The garage at 2122 was their temporary headquarters, a place to store their trucks and, more importantly, their illegal booze. The promise of cheap Canadian whiskey was the siren song that drew them in. First came the brothers, Frank and Peter Gussenberg. Frank was a hardened killer, a man with ice water in his veins who had survived multiple assassination attempts. He was Moran's primary enforcer. With them was Adam Hayer, the gang's bookkeeper and business manager. He was the one who handled the money, the one who saw the hijacked whiskey not just as a score, but as a sound financial investment. Then came Albert Kashelek, Moran's second-in-command, a cautious man who always carried a gun. Reinhard Schwimmer, an optometrist who was infatuated with the gangster life, a hanger-on who loved the thrill. Albert Wienshank and John May, a safecracker, rounded out the group. They were a collection of the city's most wanted, gathered in a single, unremarkable room. They stamped their feet against the cold, their laughter echoing in the cavernous space. They joked. They talked about the score. They checked their watches. The hijackers were late. At the same time, just a few blocks away, a scene was unfolding that would seal their fate. George Bugs Moran and two of his men were running behind schedule. Their car was stuck in traffic. As they approached the garage, Moran saw something that made him pause. A black Cadillac, sleek and official-looking, was parked down the street. He saw two men in police uniforms get out. Then a third, in a long coat, who looked familiar. Moran's street-honed instinct screamed. A raid. He turned to his men. "Let's go get a coffee," he grunted. "Let the cops clean the place out. We'll come back when they're done." They melted back into the city, their lives saved by a traffic jam and a moment of caution. Back at the garage, the seven men heard the footsteps. They saw the door open. They saw the police uniforms. They relaxed. This was routine. A payoff. A negotiated inconvenience. Frank Gussenberg might have even offered a wry smile. It was all part of the game. The men in uniform said nothing. Their faces were grim, professional. They moved with a chilling purpose. They herded the seven men against the rear wall, the rough, cold bricks scraping against their overcoats. The men complied, annoyed but not yet afraid. This was just a shakedown. Then, the Tommy guns appeared from beneath the long police coats. The illusion shattered. The two men in uniform raised the chattering, drum-fed weapons. The third man, the one in the overcoat, drew a shotgun. There was no demand for money, no reading of rights, only a brief, terrifying moment of eye contact before the world dissolved into noise and shrapnel. The sound was not like in the movies. It was louder, more mechanical, a terrifying brrrr that was both deafening and final. The Tommy guns walked their fire across the wall, stitching a deadly line from left to right. Plaster and brick dust exploded into the air, mixing with the cordite smoke to create a choking haze. The shotgun boomed, its blast a punctuation mark of sheer destructive force. The seven men were caught in a meat grinder. They had no time to draw their own weapons, no time to dive for cover. They were cut down where they stood. John May, the safecracker, was the first to fall, his head nearly severed from a shotgun blast. Adam Hayer, the bookkeeper, was hit over 20 times, his body slamming against the wall before crumpling to the floor. The others fell in a heap, a tangle of limbs and blood-soaked wool. The shooting lasted less than 10 seconds, an eternity of violence, compressed into a single, horrifying moment. Then, silence. The only sound was the ping of hot metal as the gun barrels cooled and the drip, drip, drip of blood seeping across the oil-stained concrete. The executioners moved with a cold efficiency. They stepped over the bodies, their shoes leaving faint, bloody prints. They had one final, grotesque piece of theatre to perform. The two men in police uniforms turned to the man in the overcoat. They raised their hands in a pantomime of surrender. The man in the overcoat, playing the role of the heroic detective, marched them out of the garage, his shotgun pointed at their backs. They climbed into the black Cadillac and drove away, sedately, disappearing into the morning traffic. It was a perfect performance. To any casual observer, it looked like a police raid had gone right, and the cops were leading away their captives. Inside the garage, the silence was broken by a wet, ragged gasp. Frank Gassenberg, a man of almost supernatural toughness, was still alive. He had been hit 14 times. Bullets had torn through his chest, his abdomen, his legs. Yet, he clung to life. He lay in a growing pool of his own blood, surrounded by the corpses of his friends. Minutes later, the sound of the gunfire had drawn attention. A woman living across the street called the police. The first officers on the scene were not part of Capone's plot. They were real cops. They pushed open the garage door and were hit by the thick, coppery smell. The scene before them was one of unimaginable carnage. It was a slaughterhouse. And in the middle of it all, one man was still breathing. Detectives arrived, including Sergeant Clarence Sweeney. He knelt beside Gassenberg, his own knees growing wet and warm with blood. "Frank," he said, his voice low and urgent. "For God's sake, Frank, who did this? Who shot you?" Gusenberg's eyes flooded open. The pain must have been astronomical, a universe of agony. But the code of the streets was stronger. To talk was to be a rat. To be a rat was a fate worse than death. He looked at the detective, his face a mask of pain and defiance. He used the last of his strength to form the two words that would become the epitaph for the entire Prohibition era. "Nobody shot me." He died in the ambulance on the way to the hospital. His silence sealed the mystery, but for the city of Chicago, the message was received loud and clear. The war was over. Al Capone had won. The news didn't just break, it detonated. The story of 7 men mowed down in a garage, in broad daylight, by men dressed as police, was a seismic shock that ripped through the city and then the nation. Reporters, smelling the blood-and-ink story of a lifetime, swarmed North Clark Street. Their flashbulbs popped, casting stark, momentary daylight on the ghastly scene being scrubbed by hoses. The public's appetite for the grisly details was insatiable. The St. Valentine's Day Massacre had a name before the bodies were even cold. The immediate fallout was a city paralyzed by a new kind of fear. This wasn't a back alley stabbing or a distant car bombing. This was a military-style execution. If gangsters could impersonate police, who could you trust? The very institutions meant to provide order had been weaponized by chaos. The front pages of the Chicago Tribune and the Daily News screamed the details, each more horrifying than the last. The photograph of the blood-drained wall, pockmarked with over 100 bullet holes, became an iconic image of the era's utter depravity. For Al Capone, it was a short-lived, Pyrrhic victory. He returned from Florida, tanned and smug, to a city that now regarded him with a new, more potent emotion, terror mixed with revulsion. He had achieved his goal. Bugs Moran's North Side gang was decapitated, its leadership wiped out. Moran himself was a broken man, a king without a court, who would spend the rest of his life a petty criminal, famously stating, "Only Capone kills like that." The outfit now had a virtual monopoly on Chicago's illicit thirst. But the sheer, audacious brutality of the massacre had drawn a line. The public, which had largely tolerated the gangsters as a necessary evil, a source of booze and entertainment, had its fill. The respectable businessmen and politicians who had happily taken Capone's money now found his stench too strong. The federal government, which had struggled to pin anything on him, now had a new, white-hot focus. The massacre was the catalyst. It turned Capone from a folk anti-hero into public enemy number one. The man who would bring him down was already on his trail. Elliot Ness, a young, dogged Prohibition agent, had been tasked with a near-impossible mission: build a case against Capone's empire. His team of untouchable agents, so named for their refusal to be bribed, had been chipping away at the edges, raiding breweries and warehouses. But the massacre gave Ness and his men a new urgency and, more importantly, a new public mandate. Their work was no longer just about enforcing an unpopular law, it was about avenging a city's soul. Yet, For all the headlines and public outrage, the official investigation into the massacre itself hit wall after wall. The crime scene was a masterpiece of misdirection. The police were ghosts. The black Cadillac was found abandoned, wiped clean of prints. The one potential witness, a German shepherd dog that had been in the garage, was taken to a shelter and, in a tragicomic twist, adopted before it could be examined. The case was ice cold. The Chicago Police Department, riddled with corruption from top to bottom, seemed almost willfully incompetent. Leads vanished. Witnesses developed sudden amnesia. The prevailing theory, then and now, was that the triggermen were imported from out of town, likely from Detroit's infamous Purple Gang, to ensure they had no local ties and could vanish without a trace. The mastermind was universally accepted to be Capone, but the how and the who remained a tantalizing, bloody mystery. It is here that the figure of Pets re-emerges from the shadows. For decades, the most persistent theory pointed to a man named Frederick Killer Burke, a known Capone hitman, as one of the shooters. But the man in the long overcoat, the one who orchestrated the pantomime of the arrest, was believed to be Capone's ultimate weapon. His name was rumored to be John Scalise and Albert Anselmi, or perhaps a man known only as Pets. The legend grew. He was a Sicilian assassin, a master of disguise, a man who enjoyed his work a little too much. He was the ghost in the machine, the one who pulled the trigger and then evaporated into the city smoke. But then, a twist. A competing theory, championed by some historians and retired law enforcement, suggests an even more sinister level of corruption. What if the men in police uniforms weren't just gangsters in costume? What if they were actual Chicago police officers, on Capone's payroll, lending the operation an air of terrifying authenticity? This theory posits that the entire event was not just a gangland hit, but a coordinated coup between the city's most powerful criminal and elements of its own police force. It is a theory that, if true, means the massacre was not just an attack on Moran, but on the very concept of justice. The truth died with Frank Gassenberg. Without a single reliable eyewitness, the precise identities of the executioners would become Chicago's most enduring and macabre parlor game. The official investigation would never indict a single soul for the 7 murders. It remains, to this day, the perfect, unsolvable crime. But while the Chicago police failed, the federal government did not. The massacre had painted a target on Capone's back, and Eliot Ness's untouchables were the spear point. They systematically dismantled his operations, but it was a different branch of the government that finally found the chink in his armor. The Treasury Department. They began to follow the money. While Capone was a genius at evading murder charges, he was careless with his taxes. He lived a flamboyant, public life, spending millions of dollars of income he never reported. The man who had orchestrated the most infamous gangland hit in American history, who had ruled Chicago with an iron fist, was finally brought down not for murder, not for bootlegging, but for tax evasion. In 1931, Al Capone was convicted and sentenced to 11 years in federal prison. He would eventually be sent to the newly opened, escape-proof Alcatraz Island. The king was dethroned by an accountant's ledger. The Prohibition era was living on borrowed time. The St. Valentine's Day massacre had been its horrifying, logical conclusion. It showed the nation where the noble experiment led, not to a sober utopia, but to garages filled with dead men, and to criminals so powerful they could mock the law itself. In 1933, the 21st Amendment was ratified, repealing Prohibition. The multi-billion-dollar reason for the gang wars was gone, legislated out of existence. The age of the bootlegging kingpin was over. The cell door at Alcatraz clanged shut with a finality that echoed through the cold, salt-damp corridors. Al Capone, the once untouchable behemoth of Chicago, was now just inmate AZ-85. The rock and roll of his empire was silenced. The constant stream of sycophants, the flash of camera bulbs, the taste of expensive cigars, all replaced by the bland taste of prison food and the monotonous rhythm of a convict's life. The man who had orchestrated a massacre from a sun-drenched Florida patio was now locked in a tiny, grey cell, the Pacific wind howling outside his barred window like a vengeful spirit. His mind, however, was not in the present. It was trapped in that garage on North Clark Street. The syphilis that was slowly eating his brain, a final, humiliating enemy he could not bribe or shoot, conjured the ghosts of Valentine's Day. In his delirium, he would sometimes cry out, swatting at the air, shouting about the noise, the terrible, deafening noise of the Tommy guns. He saw Frank Gusenberg's defiant eyes in the darkness. He heard the phantom clatter of shell casings on concrete. The King of Chicago was dethroned, not by a rival, but by the ghosts of his own creation and a disease that made a mockery of his power. He died in 1947, a broken shell, his fortune gone, his name synonymous not with success, but with slaughter. With Capone gone and Prohibition repealed, the gangster era didn't end, but it evolved. The outfit learned from his mistakes. They went quiet, corporate. They diversified into labor racketeering, gambling, and jukeboxes, laundering their violence through legitimate fronts. The flamboyant, public gangster was replaced by the anonymous, suited businessman of crime. The massacre had taught them that too much spectacle was bad for business. But the memory of that day refused to fade. It became a dark stain on the city's soul, a story passed down like a grim folktale. The garage itself became a macabre tourist attraction. For decades, people would slow their cars as they passed 2122 North Clark, pointing, whispering. They would take pieces of the brickwork as souvenirs, until the owner, sick of the ghoulish pilgrimage, finally had the entire structure torn down in 1967. Today, a weed-choked patch of grass and a simple plaque mark the spot, a quiet, underwhelming memorial to one of the century's most violent episodes. The ghosts, it seems, were left with no home. The debate over the precise mechanics of the massacre, however, has never died. It is a cold case that continues to fascinate and frustrate historians and true crime aficionados. The prevailing theory for decades was the work of out-of-town talent, led by the mythical Pets. But a more disturbing, and to many, more plausible, theory has gained significant traction. It suggests the shooters weren't just from the Purple Gang. It suggests they were led by a man named Frederick Killer Burke, a known and ruthless Capone enforcer. And, most controversially, it posits that the two men in police uniforms were not gangsters in disguise at all. They were real Chicago police officers, deep on Capone's payroll. This theory explains the flawless execution, the calm compliance of the victims, and the utter inability of the investigation to find any trace of the perpetrators. The Chicago Police Department wasn't just incompetent, it was complicit. It was the ultimate corruption, the final victory of the underworld over the forces meant to contain it. The massacre, then, was not just a gangland hit. It was a state-sanctioned assassination. This theory is given chilling weight by the fate of the primary murder weapons. In 1930, Killer Burke was arrested in Michigan for an unrelated murder. In his home, police made a stunning discovery: 2 fully automatic Thompson submachine guns. When ballistics experts test-fired them, a match was made. These were the very guns used in the St. Valentine's Day massacre. They had been sitting in a police evidence locker for a year, the key to solving the crime, while the investigation in Chicago remained unsolvable. It was as if the truth was laughing at them from just a few states away. The legacy of the massacre is a lesson in unintended consequences. Capone intended it to be his masterstroke, a display of power so absolute it would end all resistance. Instead, it was the beginning of his end. It galvanized public opinion, energized his enemies, and ultimately led him to a prison cell and a diseased, haunted death. It showed that there is a line, even in the underworld, and that crossing it invites a reckoning that not even the most powerful kingpin can escape. The story ends not with a bang, but with a whisper of unsettling questions that linger in the Chicago wind. It leaves us with the grim realization that the most terrifying monsters are not the ones who operate in the shadows, but those who can wear the uniform of authority while carrying out the devil's work. The true horror of the St. Valentine's Day massacre isn't just that 7 men were killed. It's that we will never know for sure who we should have been afraid of.